Afghanistan has seen decades of war, and for a while the Taliban promised to bring peace to the country. But when they seized power, they ruled with brutal extremist laws. They built a system of violence meant to control every part of life, using executions and public punishment to silence an entire population. Decades later, the scars from that system have never truly healed. The Taliban took full control of Afghanistan's capital, Kabul, in 1996, and immediately they renamed the country the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and placed it under the authority of their leader, Mullah Omar. This was the beginning of a system where modern government structures were wiped away almost overnight. There was no constitution, no elected officials, and no legal system that people could challenge or question. Instead, the Taliban ruled through their own strict interpretation of Sharia law. Courts were run by religious clerics who answered only to the Taliban leadership. These judges didn't operate like judges in modern legal systems. Trials were extremely short, evidence was often weak or non-existent, and defendants had no real way to defend themselves. There weren't any lawyers, no appeals, no second chances. Once a verdict was given, the punishment followed quickly. The U.S. State Department later described life in Taliban-controlled areas as one where strict and oppressive order is imposed and stiff punishments for crimes prevail. Their goal was to scare people into total obedience. Anyone accused of wrongdoing, whether the accusation was true or not, faced immediate and brutal consequences. Judges would announce a sentence and carry it out right away, sometimes within hours. Prisons under Taliban rule were just as cruel. They were overcrowded, dirty, and poorly supplied. Detainees were given very little food and were often beaten or tortured. Under the Taliban, punishment was never meant to happen quietly. They believed fear worked best when it was shared. That's why executions and severe punishment were often turned into public events. Court sentencing became a kind of performance, carefully designed to send a message. Townspeople were ordered to attend. Shops were sometimes closed. People were told to gather in city squares, open fields, or large stadiums. Refusing to watch could itself raise suspicion. In some cases, thousands of people were forced to stand and watch as sentences were carried out in front of them. These events were not about justice in a modern sense. They were all about control. The Taliban wanted every person in the crowd to understand what would happen if they stepped out of line. Video footage and eyewitness accounts from this period remain deeply disturbing. People describe crowds standing in silence, afraid to look away, knowing that any reaction could be dangerous. One example from this period shows how far the Taliban were willing to go. A senior Taliban judge once ordered a man convicted of murder to be executed immediately. Instead of using a firing squad, the judge applied the Taliban's interpretation of qisas, or blood revenge law. Under this rule, a member of the victim's family was ordered to carry out the execution themselves. The man was shot dead on the spot by one of the victim's relatives, in front of hundreds of onlookers. In 1997, the Taliban escalated these displays even further. Fighters publicly displayed the bodies of executed men in Kabul by hanging them from wooden beams. These were not hidden acts done after dark. The bodies were left out in the open, bruised and bloodied, where everyone could see them. According to reports from the time, the goal was intimidation. These displays were meant to warn others not to accept bribes, not to resist Taliban authority, and not to cooperate with anyone the Taliban considered an enemy. Death itself was not the final punishment. Public humiliation was part of it. This system of punishment didn't target only men. Women and girls lived under constant fear during Taliban rule. The regime banned women from attending school, working jobs, or taking part in most public life. Even small acts that were seen as disobedience could lead to violence. Human rights observers warned that brutal punishments often await women and girls who break the social norm in Taliban-controlled areas. These warnings weren't exaggerations. Women accused of moral infractions were sometimes dragged into public spaces and beaten or whipped in front of crowds. Although the Taliban were officially removed from power in 2001, These practices did not disappear. During the insurgency years, the same methods continued in areas where the Taliban still had some influence. One of the most widely reported cases happened in 2015. A video surfaced showing Taliban-linked militias stoning a 19-year-old girl named Roxana to death in Gore province. She had been accused of a moral crime. Her fiancé, accused of the same act, was not killed, but he was publicly lashed instead. The video spread quickly and shocked viewers around the world. What made the case even more disturbing was that this was not a new or rare punishment. Long before that, the Taliban had already shown that no one was beyond their reach. One of the most infamous executions in the early rule happened in September 1996, just after they captured Kabul. Taliban forces seized Afghanistan's former president, Mohammad Najibullah, who had been sheltering inside a United Nations compound. He was dragged out of the building and publicly executed. His body, along with the body of his brother, was mutilated and paraded through the streets. That execution sent a powerful message across Afghanistan. Rank did not matter. Past power did not matter. International protection did not matter. Under Taliban rule, no one was untouchable. The new government was making it clear from the very beginning that it would never show mercy, not even to a former president. So, for ordinary people, daily life was exhausting and frightening. Taliban police were everywhere, watching closely and enforcing rules that controlled almost every part of life. What people wore, how they walked, where they went, and who they spoke to were all closely monitored. Men were required to grow beards, and failing to do so could result in punishment. Women were forced to wear full burqas that covered them from head to toe whenever they stepped outside. These rules were not suggestions, they were enforced strictly, and breaking them, even by accident, could have serious consequences. Public behavior was especially dangerous. Even small mistakes could draw attention from Taliban fighters. A wrong movement, standing in the wrong place, or speaking at the wrong time could quickly turn into an accusation. Reports from that period described Taliban fighters forcing women to kneel during public rallies and then whipping them for alleged offenses. One common accusation was walking outside without a male guardian. There was no investigation, no discussion, and no chance to explain. The punishment was immediate, and it was carried out in front of others to make sure the message spread. The Taliban also treated theft as a crime deserving permanent physical punishment. A U.S. State Department human rights report from 1997 documented how Taliban judges publicly cut off the hand of a person found guilty of stealing. This wasn't done behind closed doors. These amputations were meant to be seen. The injured person was left to live with the punishment forever, both physically and socially. Public floggings were also common, especially for behavior the Taliban labeled as immoral. These beatings happened in markets, streets, and gathering places, turning everyday locations into sites of fear. The psychological impact on ordinary people was overwhelming. Afghans lived in constant anxiety, knowing that even a small misunderstanding could lead to violence. People avoided eye contact, spoke quietly, and stayed indoors whenever possible. Parents feared for their children. Neighbors avoided one another. Trust slowly disappeared. Even a wrong glance or a whispered comment could be interpreted as disrespect or rebellion, and that could be enough to trigger punishment. In late 2001, after the September 11th attacks in the United States, U.S.-led forces invaded Afghanistan and quickly dismantled the Taliban government. Within weeks, the Taliban lost control of Kabul and most major cities. Their leaders fled, many crossing into remote rural areas or neighboring Pakistan. The regime that once ruled openly through fear was suddenly gone. A new Afghan government was installed, backed by the United States and other foreign allies, and one of its first goals was to end public executions and corporal punishment. On paper, the brutal justice system from the 90s was outlawed. Stadium executions stopped. Public amputations disappeared from the cities. For many Afghans, it felt like a true moment of relief. But the Taliban were not defeated in the way people had hoped. Instead of disappearing, they just changed tactics. Over the next 2 decades, they operated as an insurgent force. They were no longer in charge of official courts or ministries, but they continued to use violence as punishment wherever they could. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, Taliban fighters carried out secret executions and intimidation campaigns, mostly in rural areas far from international attention. When they ambushed a checkpoint, overran a village, or briefly gained control of a district, they often acted as judge and executioner. These weren't formal trials. They were fast decisions made by local commanders. People accused of helping the government, working with aid organizations, or violating Taliban rules were sometimes just killed on the spot. Several incidents from this period show how calculated this violence was. In 2013, in Herat province, Taliban gunmen stormed a community meeting and executed 6 Afghan men who were involved in a rural development project. These men were not soldiers. They were civilians working on rebuilding efforts. Just 2 weeks earlier, in Ghazni province, 8 Afghan soldiers traveling by bus were stopped at what appeared to be a legitimate checkpoint. It was a trap. The soldiers were pulled off the bus and shot dead. Journalists and aid workers were also deliberately targeted. In March 2007, the Taliban kidnapped Afghan reporter Ajmal Naqshbandi in southern Helmand province. Days later, they beheaded him. His killing shocked the country and the international community. It exposed just how dangerous it was to report on Taliban activity or work with foreign organizations. Reporting from that period described a pattern of executions that was especially brutal. Captives were often held down and had their throats slit, described by witnesses as being done like slaughtering an animal. By 2007, one journalist observed that over 100 Afghans had been killed this way. Many of them were ordinary villagers or people accused of supporting the government. Some of these killings were filmed and released as propaganda to spread fear. Most, however, never reached the outside world. They were just whispered about locally, passed through villages as warnings. The violence was constant but often invisible, happening far from cameras and headlines. Even without official control of the country, the Taliban's harsh version of justice never fully disappeared. In pockets of Afghanistan where the government had little presence, local Taliban commanders enforced their own rules. Villagers later described how fighters would hold quick, informal trials, often lasting only minutes. People were judged for adultery, theft, or even owning Western music. Afghan officials warned that in Taliban-controlled districts, both men and women accused of extramarital relationships could still face death. Whippings and beatings of young people labeled as misguided or of suspected dissidents continued as well. What this meant in practice was that the fear of the 90s never truly left. It simply went underground. The same punishments existed, but they were carried out quietly without stadiums or official announcements. The Taliban enforced control whenever and wherever they had the chance. By mid-2021, this underground war escalated rapidly. As US and NATO forces began withdrawing from Afghanistan, the Taliban launched a massive offensive. District after district fell. With the chaos came a flood of horrifying evidence. Afghan authorities collected videos showing Taliban fighters beheading civilians and executing captured soldiers. In July 2021, an Afghan embassy report highlighted footage of Afghan government employees being beheaded on camera. Other videos showed unarmed soldiers surrendering, only to be lined up and shot. One of the most disturbing cases came from CNN, which obtained video footage showing 22 Afghan soldiers being shot in the back as they raised their hands to surrender. These were not battlefield deaths. They were executions. These images spread quickly and made one thing clear: the Taliban had not changed. And in August 2021, they returned to power with shocking speed. Afghan government forces collapsed, Western troops withdrew, and within days the Taliban were back in Kabul. This time their leaders claimed they had changed. They spoke to the media, promised stability, and said they would rule more moderately than in the past. They insisted they were focused on security and order, and repeatedly said they would not repeat the harsh punishments of the 1990s. For a brief moment, some people hoped this might be true. But that hope did not last long. Within months of taking control, Taliban courts quietly began issuing death sentences again. There was no independent legal system, no defense lawyers, no transparency. The same religious courts and clerics that defined the old regime were once again in charge. Slowly, familiar patterns began to reappear, and it became clear that the promises of restraint were not matched by reality. In December 2022, the Taliban carried out their first public execution in more than 20 years. The event was staged carefully and deliberately. A convicted murderer was taken to a stadium in Farah province, a place designed to hold crowds. Hundreds of people were present, including senior Taliban officials. The execution followed the Taliban's interpretation of qisas, or retribution law. The victim's own father was handed a rifle and ordered to carry out the execution himself. The man was shot dead on the spot. The Taliban Supreme Court officially announced the execution and justified it by citing the crime. The return to executions did not stop there. By mid-2023, the Taliban had confirmed a second official public execution since retaking power. In June 2023, the Taliban's media office reported that a man convicted of 5 murders was publicly executed in Laghman province. The announcement emphasized that the sentence had been reviewed and approved at the highest levels, including confirmation by the Taliban's supreme leader and senior clerical scholars. At the same time, the Taliban revived other forms of corporal punishment. The Ministry of Vice and Virtue, which had terrorized Afghans in the 1990s, returned with renewed authority. Public lashings were ordered for crimes such as adultery and robbery, using the same reasoning as before. According to United Nations monitors, more than 300 people were publicly flogged within just 6 months of Taliban rule. Most of those punished were men, but dozens of women were included. These punishments were carried out in public spaces, often in front of local communities, reinforcing fear and obedience. One of the most disturbing developments was the involvement of children in executions. In a 2025 case that made international headlines, a 13-year-old boy was forced to execute a man convicted of murdering members of the boy's family. The execution took place inside a sports stadium packed with roughly 80,000 spectators. According to Taliban statements, the victim's family was offered a choice between forgiveness and retribution. They chose the death penalty. The image of a child being forced to pull the trigger shocked observers around the world. Scenes like this are not accidents. They're deeply tied to the Taliban's strict interpretation of Sharia law, particularly qisas, where revenge killings are treated as justice. By placing weapons in the hands of victims' relatives, the Taliban turned private grief into public violence. The emotional weight of these acts spreads fear far beyond the execution itself. By the end of 2025, reports indicated that at least 11 public executions had taken place since the Taliban's return in 2021. The true number is difficult to confirm, as information is tightly controlled and many executions go unreported. Still, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Modern executions closely resemble those of the past. Rifles are handed to the victims' families. Condemned prisoners are shot in public. Crowds are gathered to watch. Each of these brutal acts has drawn international condemnation. Human rights organizations and the United Nations have repeatedly denounced the Taliban's punishments as illegal and inhumane. The UN's Human Rights Office stated flatly that public executions violate international law and conflict with the fundamental right to life. The UN's top human rights expert in Afghanistan called the death penalty cruel, inhuman, and degrading, and demanded an immediate end to all executions. UN reports and rights groups also noted that the Taliban have publicly flogged hundreds more people under various charges, despite global appeals for mercy. Afghan civilians continue to live in fear of these punishments. Many families wonder if any normal behavior could be considered safe. Women have seen girls torn out of schools, and women disappeared for minor infractions. Journalists know they can be kidnapped and killed without a trace. Even foreign aid workers and journalists can be tortured or executed if caught, as in the past. The chilling reality is that for many Afghans, everyday life involves constant worry about what might trigger the Taliban's wrath. Meanwhile, the Taliban publicly insist that their actions are just enforcement of Islamic law. Their leaders claim to scholars that they are upholding justice. But the world remembers the footage and stories of past atrocities. Images of stonings, public hangings, and shootings continue to fuel outrage. Each reported execution is met with protests by human rights defenders and calls from foreign governments to respect human rights. The regime's repeated return to these violent methods suggests that Afghanistan's brutal chapter under Taliban justice is far from over.